If you think you need fancy gear, you're wrong. iPhones are becoming more and more powerful in the filmmaking world. People are creating short films, documentaries, and all sorts of films with just a phone. It doesn't even have to be an iPhone. You can have an Android phone. Point is, mobile filmmaking is taking over. I landed my first hotel collaboration with only iPhone videos that I made. At that time, I had no camera, no fancy gear, just an iPhone. My name is Ricardo and I own a content production agency that makes videos for travel brands, destinations, and resorts. Today, I'm going to be teaching you how to make iPhone videos cinematic. The word cinematic just means how to make it look like it comes out of a film. Now, I don't want this to be a lecture. I want to make this as interesting and exciting as possible. But I have to go through key settings in using your iPhone. Now, when I just started, I just had an iPhone 12. But for now, if you want to learn about these settings that I'm about to talk about, it's more suitable to have an iPhone 14 or later, because the settings and the apps that I'll be talking about are only applicable to those iPhones for now. So this video is the first of a 3-part series. I'll be talking about the most important things that I think videos need to look cinematic. And the first thing is exposure. Exposure just talks about how the image looks after being interpreted by the camera. Now, just listen carefully. If you cannot expose an image, then you cannot produce high quality videos. If you can't expose an image, your content just won't look good. Now, without getting too complicated, there are 3 main things that affect exposure. Filmmakers call it the exposure triangle. There's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, this is very important. The 3 settings that I just mentioned to you are not accessible in the regular iPhone camera app. You have to download a third-party app. I use Blackmagic, but there are others, like Beast Grip. I just choose the Blackmagic camera app. It's one of the most popular. So you must download one of these apps, or else you can't get access to aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. In simple terms, every camera has a lens, and in the lens, you have shutter blades. The shutter blades close and they open, and when they open, they allow light to enter the sensor. Aperture just refers to how wide those aperture blades or shutter blades are open at any particular point in time. And aperture is measured in f-stops. Don't think about the units too hard. Just know that it's how wide the shutter blades are open at any point in time. The important thing is that aperture doesn't only affect exposure. It affects what we call depth of field as well. And just think of depth of field as something that measures how much the subject is in focus. The more the subject is in focus is the blurrier the background, and that usually looks more cinematic, depending on what you're trying to capture. The lower the f-stops is the wider the aperture, which means more light enters the sensor, and it also gives a shallower depth of field, aka more focus, blurrier background. Lower f-stops, wider aperture, more light. Now, let's talk about shutter speed. The shutter speed is just how fast those blades close and open. Now, clearly if they're open for a longer period of time, more light can enter the camera. But just remember, shutter speed doesn't only affect exposure. It affects motion blur as well. Not to get too complicated, motion blur is just another thing that makes your videos look cinematic. Just remember that the lower the shutter speed, or the slower the shutter speed, is the more light entering the camera. Faster the shutter speed, less light entering the camera. If the aperture blades are open for a longer period of time, light will have more time to enter the sensor. The shutter speed is usually written as 1 over another number. Just to keep it simple, the general rule is to keep the shutter speed 1 over 2 times the frames per second. And we usually keep the frames per second at 24 or 25 unless we plan to slow down footage. If you plan to slow down footage in editing, then you put it to 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. But to keep it simple, if you're just making normal videos, no slow motion, 24 frames or 25 frames per second, and set the shutter speed to 1 over 2 times. So if it's 24 frames, 1 over 48, or if it's 25 frames, 1 over 50. The reason for that is because 2 times the frames gives a sweet spot of just enough motion blur to keep the videos cinematic. So yes, shutter speed affects exposure, but it also affects motion blur. So make sure you watch till the end, because I'm going to explain how you can still adjust the exposure even though you're keeping the shutter speed constant. If the shutter speed is slower, there's more motion blur. And A lot of filmmakers utilize very slow shutter speeds in what they call the slow shutter effect. The effect is useful in a lot of videos where very slow shutter speeds just makes it look kind of cool. Now, you can't overuse the effect, but it comes in handy sometimes. And you basically do this by turning down the shutter speed really low, as low as 1/10, 1/5, or even 1/4. ISO is artificial light that your camera basically adds to the image. And so if you turn the ISO up too high, then you'll start to get what is called noise or grain in your image. The higher the ISO level, the more light, but there tends to be a sweet spot for different cameras. For my Sony a7 IV, there's what's called a native ISO. The native ISO is about 800, and that ISO gives a sweet spot where it looks very sharp, there's minimal grain. Based on my research, I haven't really been able to find a native ISO for iPhones, but from my experience, I found that iPhones tend to have very good exposure anywhere below 400. If you have to turn up the ISO above 400, that's fine, but you might start to introduce more grain depending on how much light is available in the environment. And that comes to my next point. Even though there are 3 settings that affect exposure in the camera, obviously light outside the camera has to affect exposure as well. So that's the 4th thing, but it's not a setting in camera, it's something that you can control outside the camera. You can have artificial light or natural light. We can't really control natural light, but we can manipulate it. If you're shooting in a sunny day, we can use reflectors, or we can use softeners, or we can use negative fill. You can choose what time you're shooting. You can choose to shoot at golden hour so that your footage looks better. If you're shooting indoors, you can buy different lights. I'm a travel filmmaker, I don't buy too many lights, but when I'm shooting indoors, I tend to have at least 1 or 2 lights that I use. This brings me to the next point, the importance of an ND filter. An ND filter is like sunglasses for your camera. And this is very important, listen carefully. Remember I said you want to keep the shutter speed 1/2 the frames per second. And you want to keep the ISO generally around near the native ISO for your camera. For iPhones, it tends to be somewhere around 400 to 600. You must be asking yourself, if I said the shutter speed should be constant at 1/2 the frames, and the ISO should be around a sweet spot, which is the native ISO, how am I going to affect exposure? You need an ND filter. An ND filter is basically sunglasses for your camera, and you can basically adjust those sunglasses. I'm not going to explain in too much detail how the ND filter works. Just know that if you want to adjust your exposure without changing the ISO and without changing the shutter speed, you're going to need to attach an ND filter. I have 2 ND filters, one from Freewell and one from K&F Concept. It doesn't really matter. I think both of them are of excellent quality. I just use them depending on how I feel. The setup is different and it just depends on the day. I really didn't need 2, to be honest. The K&F Concept one is something that you can screw onto the back of the iPhone. You don't need a case for it. It can literally just be clamped onto the iPhone. But the Freewell one, it requires a case that has a magnetic clamp. The thing about iPhone filmmaking is that if you can master it, trust me, it can be very convenient. Even if you do have a professional camera, the iPhone does make an excellent B camera. And as I said before, you don't have to wait to get a camera before you start making cinematic content. The iPhone is perfectly capable. I used a portfolio of only cinematic iPhone videos to land my first brand deal. And to this day, I still use my iPhone for footage, especially in cases where I can't walk around with a heavy camera all the time. So in the Blackmagic camera app, you can shoot vertical or you can choose to shoot horizontal. For me, I shoot 95% of my content horizontally. That's just me, everybody has their preference. Some people shoot vertically for short form content and then shoot horizontally for long form content. I just shoot everything horizontally, and if I want, I can crop in or I can just post everything horizontally. Shooting horizontally for me makes it easier for me to recycle any piece of content, whether for YouTube, IG, TikTok. The key here is to just practice and play around with the app. In future videos, I'll talk about log. I don't want to bombard you with too much information now, but in future videos, we'll talk about log footage and the difference between log, Rec 709, and when to shoot in log, and how to understand conversion from log to Rec 709. But for now, you can shoot in Rec 709, doesn't really matter, especially if you don't plan to color grade or edit too much, you just want the footage to look more cinematic. Alright, so guys, that's basically it for part 1 of this series, and in subsequent videos I'll talk about camera movements and camera angles and adding depth to your image by placing the camera at different spots. Thank you so much guys. If you enjoyed this video and if it was very informative, subscribe for more. I'll be back again. Peace.